Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming out on this glorious day. It is chilly but beautiful. We're in the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium for History is Lunch. I am Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. If you have not already, please silence your phones. Don't forget about our special exhibits upstairs, Spirits of the Passage and the Quilts of Gwendolyn McGee. Those are both up for several more months, but if you have not caught them yet, they are well worth your time. A few events coming up I want to make sure everyone knows about. This Friday at 4:30, former United States Poet Laureate and Mississippi native Natasha Trethewey will deliver the 5th annual Betty Jolly Lecture at the Eudora Welty House and Garden. That free event is co-sponsored by the department, the Eudora Welty Foundation, and Millsaps College. In the event of inclement weather, the program will move to the Gertrude C. Ford Academic Complex at Millsaps College. There's a chance of rain. They'll make that call on Friday morning. We'll post it on the websites, or you can call the Welty House to find out. Next Tuesday at noon, in the Old Capitol Museum, James Pate, Emeritus Professor of History at the University of West Alabama, will discuss the reissue of James Pickett's 1851 book, The Annotated History of Alabama, and incidentally Georgia and Mississippi, which he edited. A book signing will follow. Looking forward to that. It'll be really good. Tuesday at noon of next week at the Old Capitol. Then join us back here next Wednesday for History's Lunch when Randall Kennedy will present The Desegregation of Swimming Pools in Jackson, Palmer v. Thompson Reconsidered. Kennedy is Michael R. Klein Professor at Harvard Law School and a former law clerk for United States Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall. Do not miss that. Today, we are delighted to have Eric Etheridge with us to discuss the second and expanded edition of his book, Breach of Peace, Portraits of the 1961 Mississippi Freedom Riders. A native of Mississippi, Etheridge lives in New York City. He's worked as an editor at Harper's, the New York Observer, Rolling Stone, and other magazines. Help me welcome Eric Etheridge.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you, Sybil. Thank you, Sybil, and everyone else for coming out today. Good afternoon. I'm thrilled to be here in this magnificent new space. Not only is it a great new museum, 2 museums about Mississippi, but it is also the home of the mugshots. They live somewhere over there. They won't let me near them, the originals. I told them I would just fondle them gently. But I feel like I've come home to the mothership, so I'm very excited to be here. I'm just looking for a couple of people. I don't see them yet. I want to introduce. I do want to start out by thanking the people at the Department of Archives and History who were so helpful to me back in the day, in the early 2000s, when I was starting to work on the book. Some of them are still here. Some of them have moved on to other places. But I would like to thank especially Sarah Morrow, who was my guide to the Sovereignty Commission files, Dave Pilcher, Celia Tisdale, Matthew Glover, and Christy Wilson. So thank you very much. I also want to, we have at least one freedom rider with us today. I would like Dolores Williams to stand up and take a bow. Dolores is one of the many, many, many freedom riders from Mississippi, and she'll be signing books with me after we finish here with the program. And also, I don't see him yet, but I hope Hezekiah Watkins will be joining us today. He's a freedom rider also from Jackson, who now works here in the museum, I think every morning. If you haven't been through the Civil Rights Museum, you should get him as your guide. It'd be awesome. And if you have been, you should come back and go through it again with him, because it would be a very special experience. The first edition of my book was published in 2008, so about 11 years ago. And it's interesting to think, as we sit here and stand here in this new museum, about how the southern landscape of remembrance has changed so much in just a decade. 10 years ago, there was really only the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute and the earliest version of the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis. Today, the Memphis Museum has greatly expanded. The Center for Civil and Human Rights has opened in Atlanta. The Freedom Rider Museum has opened in Montgomery, and more recently, the Lynching Memorial and the related museum have opened in Montgomery. And in Jackson, we have this splendid new space. So as the Confederate monuments are coming down, the civil rights monuments are going up. I think we can all agree, I hope we can, that this is progress. And the Freedom Rider mugshots are prominently displayed here. I hope you've all seen that. Also in Memphis and in Atlanta, as of course they should be. They're really a powerful display when amassed and put all together. So congratulations to Katie Blunt and Ms. Pamela Jr., and I know hundreds of other people who are responsible for creating these two new museums, and well done. Ten years ago, when I started speaking about the Freedom Rides and talking about my book around the country, I spent more time telling the history of the rides, and not enough time, I felt, talking about the individual riders. Today, you all have access to this museum and the others. You can watch the PBS documentary about the Freedom Rides online. Also on YouTube, you can watch the Eyes on the Prize episode about the Freedom Riders. I recommend all of these to you, as well as Ray Arsenault's book, The Freedom Riders. Also, David Halberstam's book, The Children, is very good and covers a lot of this stuff. So I want to talk more about the Freedom Riders today and less about the history, but for those of you who maybe didn't do your homework last night and brush up on the Freedom Rides, I would do a quick review. The rides were created by James Farmer and CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, and they thought them up in late 60, early 61. The original plan was to a bus ride from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans over about 2 weeks. The riders planned to integrate the bus stations along the way as they traveled, and trying to draw attention to the fact that all the stations in the South were still segregated, even though that was illegal, and the Supreme Court had said so. But of course, the stations were all segregated, and the federal government was doing nothing to enforce the law. 3 horrific attacks in Alabama, firebombing in Anniston, mob violence in Birmingham and then Montgomery, indeed brought national and international attention to the issue, and basically kind of ended the rides briefly. The rides were resuscitated first by the Nashville student movement, and then from members of the CORE chapter in New Orleans. They continued the rides into Jackson on May 24th, not knowing if they were riding to another brutal beating and possible death. Unknown to them, however, Bobby Kennedy and Jim Eastland had cut a deal. The riders would be kept safe. The Kennedys wanted no more violence. And Mississippi's solution was to arrest them all. As they got off the bus, they basically went through a cordon of police and media, off the bus, into the station, out of the station, into the police van, and off to the city jail. This was a strategic mistake on Mississippi's part, which the riders are very quick to recognize. They quickly switched their plans. No longer were they heading to New Orleans. Now they would focus on filling the jails in Jackson. This was the Gandhian tactic of jail, no bail, of using the state's power against itself. They put out the call for people to come to Jackson, get arrested. And people really responded very quickly. The jails were full within 2 weeks. And then Mississippi's idea was to take this overflow crowd up to Parchman, where they put them in maximum security cells and locked them up basically 24/7. Although they did threaten them when the riders were misbehaving in the eyes of the guards and the warden. He said, "If you guys don't behave, we're going to make you chop cotton." Now, there were a lot of riders there not from Mississippi in the South who did not really know what chopping cotton was, but it was still a threat to them. All in all, over the spring and summer and into early September, 329 people were arrested in Jackson at the Trailway Station, the Greyhound Station, the train station, and even a few at the airport. Their refusal to stand down in the face of violence led to victory. The Kennedy administration said in September it would begin to enforce the law. So the Freedom Riders won. Diane Nash later said that the strategy of the rides was very novel, and it was very simple. She said, the South is either going to kill us or desegregate. So that was the proposition that they had put forward, and they won, even though there were some people who were almost killed, and a few people who were sort of permanently injured after the beatings in Alabama. There were other benefits to the rides as well. I'll take a pause here to say hello to Hezekiah Watkins, just walking in. I've already said all the good things about you, Hezekiah, so you missed that. All right, I'll give it. You can watch it on the repeat. I will say I was holding this in case when you got here. Hezekiah is just about to publish a book, his autobiography, in the next few weeks. I'm very much looking forward to reading that. Hezekiah was arrested over 100 times in Mississippi while he was a high school student, mostly working in the movement all over the state, in the Delta, Canton, and Jackson for sure. He was beaten many times. I told him, I said, but Hezekiah, when he told me he was publishing a book, I said, Hezekiah, you're the freedom writer. I'm the book guy. But I'm really happy that he's put his story in print, and I'm looking forward to reading it. And I urge you all to pick up a copy as soon as you can. There were other benefits to the campaign as well. The rides gave the movement a template for future campaigns that they would turn to in Georgia and Alabama and elsewhere. And like with the example of Hezekiah, it really created the movement in Mississippi. Mississippi was extremely locked down in the early 60s, as many of you, I'm sure, know. When there were sit-ins really everywhere across the South, from Washington, D.C. to Nashville to Georgia, Atlanta, Tennessee, everywhere. In 1960, there was really nothing here except for the wade-ins on the Gulf Coast. And really the first sit-in wouldn't come in Mississippi until 63 at the famous Woolworth sit-in. But because so many people from Mississippi participated in the rides and were arrested and locked up and thrown in Parchman with the likes of James Farmer and John Lewis and Bernard Lafayette and C.T. Vivian and so forth and so on, it really turned Parchman into Movement University in the summer of 1961. So people like Hezekiah and Dolores came out of prison having studied nonviolence and how to affect change. And so off they went to Jackson or Macomb and the Delta and so forth and so on. They were now the vanguard of the movement in Mississippi. As Chris said, I have a new edition of the book. The first one came out in 2008. This one came out last fall. And it's an expanded edition published by Vanderbilt University. I was able to update the information about all the writers from 10 years ago and able to add about 16 new people featured to the book. So really felt like I was able to fill in more of the dots of the portrait of the writers. It has, like I said, all 329 mugshots of the people who were arrested here, and my portraits and profiles of 99 of the writers. It's basically, you can think of my book as basically a yearbook of the freedom rides. And it's organized chronologically as the groups came into Jackson. This is the first group that made it to Jackson on May 24th. I've never used a laser pointer before, so bear with me. There's James Bevel from Itabena, who's a major leader in the movement. There's Dave Dennis, who ran Freedom Summer from New Orleans in Mississippi. C.T. Vivian. James Lawson is probably, besides Bayard Rustin, probably the most important teacher and philosopher of nonviolence and educator of nonviolence. He really created the Nashville movement almost single-handedly. And here is another page, similar page. This is like 2 weeks later, so June 8th. You can see all these people coming from all over the place to come to Mississippi. And they're flying into the airport. They're coming into the train station from New Orleans. They're coming from Montgomery, and they're coming from Nashville to the train station. Nashville, New Orleans, and Montgomery were the three primary staging cities. People knew to get there, and then they would connect with CORE in New Orleans or the movement in Montgomery or the movement in Nashville. They'd maybe get a day or two of training, maybe walk a picket line, and then they'd be put on a bus or train into Mississippi. I know you guys, Jomo Hollen has been one of the more prominent freedom writers in the last few years, talking, and her son made a documentary about her, and I know she's been here several times. You guys may be familiar with her. Percy Sutton was a big Manhattan politician. He flew in to get arrested with Mark Lane, who was a reporter. There's Stokely Carmichael, who was a freedom writer. And everybody loved Stokely. Everybody that knew him told great stories about Stokely. So then, my pages, John Lewis. So the new portrait, the old mugshot, a little biographical detail, and then an excerpt from the interview that I did with everybody. He was, of course, in the first book. Luvon Brown was from Jackson. He's somebody new to the new edition. They're very happy to get him in. Fascinating fellow. Lives up in Westchester now. Carol Silver was in the first edition, but this is a new photograph of her. We took the Freedom Riders all to Parchman in 2011 for the 50th anniversary. And I was running around like crazy in the maximum security unit trying to get pictures on the fly. And there she is in her, I don't know if it's her cell, but a cell at the maximum security unit in Parchman. But the heart of the project is the mugshots, and they're really so amazing on a number of different levels. This is, you probably recognize Helen Singleton if you're familiar with the book at all. She was on the cover of the first edition. You can see it's kind of a document of, it's got, these are staple holes, maybe you can't quite make them out. It's been hole punched up there. It's like a document of the repressive state. But it's also this really beautiful photograph of a young woman from California who's just been arrested in Mississippi, probably not a good idea, and yet she's got this amazing expression on her face. So we're so lucky to have these photographs of these people sort of in the heat of battle, to be able to sort of think about what they were doing, why they came to Mississippi. The reason that I was able to do my project, in addition to having the mugshots, is on the back of all of them was all this amazing information. Her full name, her current address, her birth city, her birth date, and some other information. But between a full name, a birth date, and the internet, you can really do some damage. So I was able to find people, I put together a spreadsheet of this information way back when, and started searching the internet and looking for phone numbers, and off I went. I forgot to say, and because I'm not doing my regular old speech, the reason that we have the mugshots today and the reason they're here at the archives is they were all saved by the Sovereignty Commission. Everybody knows what the Sovereignty Commission is here, right? You guys are up. All right. So The Sovereignty Commission files eventually the commission was shut down in the 70s. Then there was like a 25-year lawsuit. Then the commission papers were released to the public via the archives. And every piece of paper, including the photographs and the mugshots, are online, which is awesome. Thank you, Mississippi Department of Archives and History. I wanted to show you also, this is Bob Singleton, Helen's husband. And this is really another beautiful photograph and American portrait. If you know a little bit about the history of photography and the history of photography in in the U.S., and how mugshots were developed and so forth and so on, it's really has an interesting place in the history of photography in this country, but that's a different lecture. I want to talk about quickly, how important it is that we have these mugshots. They really allow us to take the measure of these individuals to really understand the freedom rides at the individual level. And we do not have this ability for really any other campaign in the civil rights movement. You don't know everybody who went on the march from Selma to Montgomery. We don't know everybody who participated in the Albany campaign or the Young People's campaign in Birmingham. So this is really a remarkable set of images and documents. And really there were 330 riders here. There were rides really all over the South in 61. Texas, Florida, Washington to Florida, Albany, Georgia, a number of places. And another 100 riders in addition to the ones here. But their story is not as well known because we don't have any mugshots of those people. The mugshots didn't survive. We also can really draw lessons from these people. We can draw inspiration from them. Here are these people who are putting their lives on the line, who really believe that they're doing something to make the country better. They really are sort of projecting a sense of civic engagement that maybe now more than ever is relevant since 1961. There was an interview with one of the riders who was a white rider who was coming up from New Orleans to get arrested, and the TV man was interviewing him on the newsman was interviewing him on the train. He said, "Well, what are you doing? Why are you down here? What do you hope to accomplish?" He said, "Well, I want to make it so that all Americans can eat together and can travel together." And then the reporter said, in a kind of a nice version of a question that was being asked, less nicely by other people, "Why is it your responsibility to do this?" And he said, and he told me later, he said, "This is the best thing I ever said in my whole life." He said, "I think it's every American's responsibility." So I draw a lot of inspiration and ideas from that, and I think it's one of the great reasons we have, one of the great effects of having the mugshots. You can characterize the writers in a number of ways, classify them stuff. Just some basic facts: half were white, half were black. And these are Mississippi numbers, but I think they pretty much map to the whole group of 400, the ones elsewhere around the country. 3/4 were men, 1/4 were women. They were really young, like 70% were under 30. And then like 50% were under 21, maybe 60% were under 21. They came from really all over the country by birth. About 1/3 came from the South, 1/3 from the Northeast and the Midwest, and 1/3 from the West. Another way to categorize them and to think about why they came here to Mississippi is we can divide them into two groups of being in 1961 woke and unwoke. For many writers like Catherine Burks Brooks, who was on the cover of the new edition, the Freedom Rides were just the next campaign. She was a veteran of the 1960 sit-in campaign. She was a student at Tennessee State in Nashville. And, for people like her, this was like I've done all the stuff in '60, so I'm ready to go in 1961 to the Freedom Rides. And she was part of the group that came out of Nashville after the violence in Alabama into Birmingham to keep the rides going. And when I talked to her, she told me about her struggle with nonviolence and understanding it as an idea and as a tactic and getting comfortable with it, even though it wasn't really her first instinct. And she said it was touchy to have someone maybe push you and not to be able to push back when you're out there protesting. She said, I was Christian and everything, but I was kind of used to not stepping to the side. With the nonviolence, I was stepping to the side. Now, I think we can all agree this looks like a woman who is not used to stepping to the side, right? It's just a great, great portrait. I presented with Catherine last November at the Freedom Ride Museum in Montgomery. She's great. She tells awesome stories about her car ride with Bull Kana. I really can't duplicate her accent, but it's magnificent. And she lives in Birmingham today, which is where she grew up. Now, one of her colleagues in the student movement was Pauline Knight of FOSU. When I went to see her, she was from Nashville, also a student at Tennessee State. And I talked to her about the same things I talked with Catherine about. But Pauline had no qualms about nonviolence. There was no conflict. She had the spirit. She was with the spirit, and she still had it many years later in the early 2000s when I was talking to her. She said, there was something I remember. You cannot hate. You cannot hold this person, your opponent at a picket or a sit-in. You cannot hold this person in error. You've got to see them for who they are. They don't know it, maybe, but they are God's children too. It was that kind of thing that gave you the strength and brought you forward. Pauline had a busy career in sort of medical technology. She was a teacher and also worked for a long time for the EPA in Georgia, and she died a few years ago. Another Tennessee National Student Movement member was Freddy Leonard. He was originally from Chattanooga, and in 1960 he was a senior in high school. And so instead of desegregating downtown Nashville, he worked on downtown Chattanooga as a high school senior. And then when he came to Nashville, he was ready to go, and he still lives in Nashville today. Hank Thomas was a student at Howard University. Maybe some of you know him, remember him. He was one of our lead organizers for the 50th anniversary event in 2011. And then I think he was also worked very hard on Freedom Summer 50th anniversary in 2014. Hank was originally from St. Augustine, Florida, and at Howard he had joined the Nonviolent Action Group, as they call their movement there. Think of the acronym NAG. They picketed in D.C. and did sit-ins in Virginia and Maryland. And Hank was one of the 13 original writers who left Washington in early May in '61, and he was on the bus that was firebombed in Anniston, Alabama, and he was came into Jackson on the first day on May 24th. Now, I promised some new stories in one of my online postings about the speech today, and this is a new story about Hank, I can tell. Hank ended up in Vietnam in like '66. The draft board came looking for him, and as they did a number of freedom riders, and Hank joined the Army as a medic. He thought that would be the best way out of his situation, and then he ends up in Vietnam very early. And I asked him about his experience over there, and he said, well, one day I was on the fire base, and I looked up and I saw the rebel flag. And he said, I'm not a very good shot, but if you put an M16 on full automatic, you can do some damage. So Hank shot the flag down. It's kind of an early take 'em down moment in the movement. This is Deion Diamond. He was a classmate of Hank's at Howard, another nagger. At first, when he came down, Hank got injured, so that really motivated and activated all the folks at Howard to come down. And when he came down, and as you can see, he was arrested on the first day in Jackson too, May 24th. He said, well, I thought I was just, going down for the weekend. Get arrested, go to jail, get bail out, go back to Howard. He was working on the sit-in model. This was not the Freedom Rider model. He said, but that short weekend turned into 60 days in jail and prison. And so, well, there goes that semester. So he talked to SNCC, what can I do with the rest of my time here? And they said, they sent me straight to Macomb. I was in the South for the next 2 years as a field secretary for SNCC, mostly in Mississippi, with occasional sojourns to other southern states. So you can see how it was very nimble. People threw their lives into it, not really knowing what was going to happen, and were willing to give up 2 years of their life to work in the movement, if not longer. And there's Deion in my Parchman portrait from 2011. Jean Thompson was, again, May 24th. She was a member of New Orleans Corps. Her sister was a member of New Orleans Corps. Her other sister was a member of New Orleans Corps. I'm going to do a parents and child thing in a minute, but I want to just tell you what she said. I always ask people, what did your parents tell you about race when you were growing up? How did you discuss it? And Jean said, my parents always talked about the injustice of segregation, but they were optimistic. They didn't feel like it would last forever. They raised us to be ready. I remember my dad saying, the day will come and you should be ready. When she got back home from New Orleans, she bailed out early to go back to be one of those people that helped the new writers get acclimated and get into Mississippi. Her father called. He was in Colorado. He had been fired from his job in New Orleans because of his daughter's activities as civil rights activists. And he called her on the phone and he said, what are you doing this for? And I had to remind him that this is what you told us to do. So he didn't say anything more. Dave Dennis, there's Jean today. She was here in 2011. Dave Dennis, I pointed him out earlier, was another big member of the Corps group in New Orleans. That's not Dave Dennis. Oh, sorry, this is yesterday's slideshow. Okay. Or maybe I didn't change it. This is yet another member of the New Orleans Corps. This is Jerome Smith, who's a really fascinating fellow. He's new to this edition, and he's still living in New Orleans. He's really had a profound influence through kids groups that he's run since the late 60s, a really profound influence on New Orleans music, especially the brass band music. He created a club for kids, like I said, in the late 60s. Okay, this is Frank Holloway. He was from the Atlanta student movement. He died a few years ago. And this is Rey Randolph from the Richmond student movement. He did a lot of sit-in stuff in 1960 in Richmond. He lives outside of Detroit today. Can you tell what he did for his living? He was a salesman. He sold Fuller brushes. He sold Encyclopedia Britannicas door to door, but most of his career was working for a big drug company. He was very successful. We'll get back to Ray in a minute. There were other people, of course, outside the South, but these kids, these about a third of the writers, these were people who were ready to go. These were people who were kids who wanted their freedom now. They were very impatient with the NAACP. They didn't like the litigious approach. They wanted action, and CORE provided that opportunity for them, and that evolved into SNCC and the next really several years of activity all across the South. There were other people outside the South who were woke and ready to go. David Fankhauser grew up in a political household in Indiana. His parents were members of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which is a nonviolent group, and they're very active on race issues. And they intentionally lived below the poverty line to avoid paying war taxes. So David was ready to go. He called up his buddy. Well, here he is. I want to show you. He's David was a very enthusiastic freedom rider. There he is. He lives in Cincinnati. He just retired. He was a university professor his life. There he is in 2011 at Parchman, very enthusiastically singing after our lunch they provided for us. Now, this is who he called up David Myers. This is a buddy of his. They were both students at Wilberforce in Ohio. And David, of course, had been raised political too, in the words of his girlfriend and later wife, Winona. You see here, David Winona. Now, David told Winona when he went off to be on the Freedom Rides, it was too dangerous for her to go. And she had to stay home. And we'll see how that worked out in a minute. You remember Helen and Bob from the beginning? They put together a group of like 14 students, mostly from UCLA. They lived in LA. Bob was a student at UCLA. Helen was a student at Santa Monica City College. Bob had started an NWC chapter at UCLA, and they brought a big group in. And there's Helen from her portrait and the cover of the last edition, and Bob. Now, Mimi Reel was another raised political type. She grew up in Brooklyn, her parents dragging her to various protests. In high school, she went on a march in D.C. to support Brown v. Board. In college at Swarthmore, she organized, sympathy pickets at the stores to support the sit-in movement down south. Like a lot of freedom riders, she came back to the South in '64 to work in Freedom Summer. There she is. She spent about a year plus in Louisiana doing voter registration and freedom schools and the sort. And she lives in San Francisco today. She's been an educator, teacher, and administrator her whole life. Now on the same bus, this is interesting, we're going to switch over to the unwoke people now. On the same bus as Mimi was Judith Freeze Wright. And she's a really great example of how the Freedom Rides expanded the movement and helped to change the country. She had never really done anything like this before. She had been activated by the photographs from the sit-in campaign in '60. She said, seeing the pictures of the sit-ins was a real turning point for me. I can remember when I first saw the pictures sitting on my bed in college. I mean, I can see the quilt I was sitting on. I was totally hooked on what was happening in the South. My group spent the night in Montgomery before going into Jackson. There was a mass meeting in a church. It was the first time I heard the freedom songs. I remember walking to the church and the sound getting louder and louder, and then the door opening and having the sound burst out on me. It was really moving, but I was shy and I felt awkward, and I hadn't had the kind of experiences that others had. I remember Mimi particularly. She had done this before, and she was right in there singing. I felt longing to be in there with her. And then they opened their arms up to me, and I went in and ended up howling out these songs. It was really wonderful. It was my political awakening. Judith came back to Mississippi for Freedom Summer, worked in Meridian for a year with her husband. Later in the 60s, she was active in the anti-war movement. In the 70s, she was very active in the women's movement. And beginning in the 80s, she spent 10 years working on the AIDS Action Committee in Boston. So this is a story that you see over and over in the Freedom Rides. This is the first thing they did, but it really changed their lives in many ways and led to different things in their futures. Other riders, you were woke. Oh, there she is today. Oh, that's, again, a picture from Parchman. Stephen Greene was a Middlebury student, very proud of himself, felt very advanced. He gave a tour to Reverend William Sloane Coffin before the Freedom Rides of Middlebury, and William Sloane Coffin said to him, "Wow, this is a great place to go to sleep for 4 years." And he, sort of like, whoa, what does that mean? And so he started to think, and he started to, try to figure out what was going on. And he came to Mississippi and got arrested. And, he said, I was from a relatively privileged background and thought I had a pretty good sense of what was happening. I'd done things, But once I was thrown in jail in Jackson, it instantly became apparent how much I didn't know. I remember hearing the guy in the drunk tank. What the hell is he screaming about? Well, he's detoxing. He's a druggie, and he's going to have to tough it out. I mean, nobody can sleep, and screams from this individual are unearthly, and everyone else understands what it is. And I don't have the faintest idea. When we started talking about finances and wagers and labor and unions, look, I was a reasonably intelligent 21-year-old who thought I was pretty well prepared to deal with the world. I'd been to France for the summer. I spoke another language. But I didn't have the faintest idea what was going on. I was thinking, God damn it, how did I get to be this old and be this dumb about how things are? I realized just how deficient my education had been in a broad sense. I don't know how much more intensively your life could be changed and your politics be changed and your view of the world be changed in 42 days. If there was a way to do it any faster, I can't imagine. By the time I got out of Parchman, I wanted to eat the world, literally. So that's what I've been doing ever since. Stephen went on to work for the UN for a number of years all over the world. He was in Ethiopia and helped to uncover the famine during Haile Selassie and worked in a lot of other hot spots over his time. I'm going to speed up here because I'm running out of time. Morton, this is Alex Weiss, was born in Austria in 1936. He got out of the country with his parents and sister in 1940, almost at the last minute. Grew up in San Francisco. And when he saw pictures from Mississippi and Alabama, he said, I don't want to be a good German, and just looked the other way. So off he went to Mississippi. When he came back, he was the direct action chairman for CORE in San Francisco for several years. This was his cellmate in Parchman, Mort Linder. Mort was a veterinarian about to be. He had graduated veterinarian school, moved to San Francisco from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and was waiting on his license to come through. So he had a summer to kill. Well, I'll go to Mississippi. This is the only time I'll have to do that in my life. Now you might imagine, you can see, he lives up in Point Reyes now, north of San Francisco with his wife, and Alex came up and spent the day with us. So we had a really interesting afternoon. And I also photographed Mort and his wife Jenny. As you can see, the hippies were here in 1961. And it probably wouldn't surprise you if I told you they went to Burning Man every year from 2000 to 2013. They were also living in San Francisco. They were photographed by the great photographer Irving Penn in 1967. He is a hippie couple. He is a veterinarian. It's really, a great portrait, and I knew that it was in the back of my head when I went there, and I was like, oh, I'm not up to this challenge, but I tried. David Morton was a big hippie, and somebody on the internet who knows said he may have been the first hippie. He shaved his beard and cut his hair to come to Mississippi like a lot of people, so he looks like a clean-cut kid. But really, this is what he looked like. This is 1966, and by then he was living in California, and he'd started a band called the Juke Savages, which was a jug band in which all the hippies on the West Coast thought, these people are really far out. And he played with his band at the first acid test in Los Angeles, Ken Kesey, in the book that Tom Wolfe wrote. And then after the 60s were over, he moved way back up north in Minnesota and became a construction worker. Okay, now, I'm really running out of time. I'm going to skip ahead. Sorry. Oh, wait a minute. There's our friend Dolores, sweet young girl. On Sunday, July the 9th, 1961, there's a whole little riff I have about how people dealt with their parents. She told her mama she was going to church. But what she didn't say was from the church, she was going to the railway station to get arrested. Sorry, I'll have to do these next time. I want to end with, there's Winona, of course. She became a freedom rider anyway, despite what her boyfriend told her. She said he was not the boss of me. And David said that's the last time he ever told her what she was supposed to do. Okay, this is the last guy here. This is, hold on, let me catch up here with my notes. This is Jesse Davis from Jackson, Mississippi, another new guy in the new edition. I'm very happy to get him in to fill in the blanks a little bit more about Mississippi. Everybody in Mississippi, a lot of people in Mississippi, like Jesse, like Lou Vaughn, I'm sure Dolores and Hezekiah, wanted to do something, but they knew it wasn't possible until some organized effort came here. And I would just want to read what Jesse told me about his time, and how kind of he was recruited to be in the Freedom Rides. I remember when I first heard about the North Carolina sit-ins, I said, man, when can something like that come to Jackson? And then shortly after the rides came to Jackson, I went down to Blair Methodist Church for a mass meeting. I heard, I think, James Bevel and Bernard Lafayette speak. They were saying things like, guys, if you want to change things in Mississippi, you're going to have to take an active role. There are other actions that you're going to have to do, but this is the first one. Your governor, Ross Barnett, has said our citizens don't want to be involved in this. They don't care. They like it the way things are. And I said, this is Jesse again, I said, whoa. I'd heard Barnett before, but to hear an outsider repeat it, it was a call to duty. When the meeting ended, Fred Clark, who's another Jackson writer, took the leading role in our little group. He said, look, we have to go. And I said, yes, we have to go, but I need to think about it a little bit. He said, no, we have to go now. And if you think about it right, if you're coming from New York or the West Coast, it's an involved process to go on the Freedom Rides. And getting on a plane or a car or a bus to Nashville or New Orleans, it's a long way, but it's not so hard. The danger is far off. But for the people who were here, it was just a short car ride away. So Fred said, no, we have to go now. So I got in the car with Fred, Joe Watts, and some of the others, and we drove to the Trailway Station and got arrested. When I first walked into the church, I felt somewhat liberated. But when they put me in the police wagon, I felt like the chains had fallen off. I was thinking about verses in the Bible about the chains falling off, and I was feeling free. So thank you very much for coming today. I'll be happy to, there's Jesse, living in upstate New York. Unfortunately, he died last year. I'll be happy to take any questions. Chris has a microphone. If you can wait till he gets there and then ask me. Thank you very much.
Raise a hand and we'll bring the mic to you. Hey.
My stepfather's brother, Robert Greene, is in your book.
There are a lot of people that, who've already deceased or I couldn't find that I don't have at the top of my head, but let me look in the index. Robert Greene. Yes, Robert Greene. He's in there. Page 128. Do you know anything about him very much? Let's talk afterwards.
I just have a comment to make.
Sure.
And because I was in San Francisco at the time, they weren't hippies, they were beats. The hippies didn't start out until the first was 64.
Right. They were pre-hippies. And in fact, the writers were criticized because the word hippie didn't exist yet. The writers were criticized for being beatniks.
Right.
That's all they had at the time. But eventually they did become hippies.
Beatniks were a little more intellectual.
I understand, but I'm not going to argue with you. Yes, sir.
This is not so much a question, it's more a comment.
There's civil rights struggle and the illustration, photographs illustrating the commitment to the struggle for racial justice and racial equality. I think it impacted the belief at least in the British West Indies, the Caribbean. It influenced the leaders in the colonies in the British West Indies. You have people who felt, well, what was happening in the 50s and 60s for freedom and justice, the people in the colonies, the British West Indies and the colonies, were influenced by this, the pictures especially in the freedom struggle. And some of those leaders, people like Jeddy Jagan, were influenced, and they felt it's okay to go to prison for freedom and justice. And I think a lot of that influence, they were influenced because of the pictures they saw of young people and old people getting involved in the struggle and trying to get their freedom and liberty and justice and equality. The people in the colonies and the British West Indies felt that they too, it's okay to go to prison to get liberty. And I think the pictures illustrated that it was okay to go to prison. Before the pictures, they weren't so keen to go to prison because prison meant a stigma of criminal activity. But seeing the pictures of a political struggle, they too felt that it was okay to go to prison for their freedom. And so, especially during the period of independence for the colonies trying to get their independence, they also, it was okay for them to go to prison.
Absolutely, yes, I agree. The Freedom Riders are profoundly influential outside the country, in the colonies, as you mentioned, in the Caribbean, and also there was the Freedom Rider campaign modeled almost exactly on what happened here in Australia a few years later by the indigenous people there to try to get more rights. And going to jail was a stigma, especially in the black community and the white community. It wasn't something that parents are ready for. So you had people like Dolores and other people I was sorry I didn't have a chance to talk about, sort of not telling their parents they were going to Mississippi. And it wasn't just the kids, high school and college students. Wyatt T. Walker was Martin Luther King's number 2 guy at the SCLC, and he was married to Teresa Walker, and they were adults. They had 4 children. The oldest one was 11. And every summer they sent the kids off to live with Teresa's mom and grandmother and father in New Jersey, which is where Teresa was from. And so when I was talking to them, I said, well, you must have told them that, the kids are coming up and we're going to Mississippi to get arrested. And Teresa said, oh, no. Let me see if I can dig that out real quick. She said something like, I don't know if I ever told Mabel what we were doing. She would have had a spell. And Wyatt spoke up at that point, and he goes, oh, yeah, her mother was a tough woman. And then when Teresa and Wyatt just stayed in jail for a few days here in Jackson, they never went to Parchman, they bailed out. But Teresa said that while she was in jail, she really got to missing her kids. So she wrote them a letter and sent it off, and it had to say Hinds County Jail on the envelope. So when she saw her grandmother again later in that summer or in the fall, her grandmother said to her, I have never been so embarrassed as when the mailman brought me a letter that said Hinds County Jail on the outside. So this is definitely a stigma that, people that, the kids and some of the adults too had to get over.
Hello.
Hi.
At least 2 of the people that you presented today were students at Howard University. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the role of historically black colleges and universities in organizing the freedom rides or just the movement more broadly.
Well, I mean, it is super important. I mean, I don't know if I have anything smart to say about it or analytical, but the National Student Movement really came out of Fisk, HBCU, Tennessee State, ditto, Howard, Emory, not Emory, the schools in Atlanta whose names are escaping me right now. Thank you. You know, these are kids who are going to college maybe for the first generation in their families. They were being exposed to all these ideas. There was a freedom rider from Howard that just died named James Moody. There's something, he wrote this amazing letter. He was here, arrested in Mississippi, and he wrote this amazing letter to his parents after he'd been in jail for about 3 days here in Jackson. And it's now part of the collection at the Smithsonian African American Museum. And I published it on my blog, which is reachofpeace.com, if you want to go look it up. It's really a remarkable document because he explains to them what the strategy is of being in Mississippi. And you think about it, if you have an organization that even the least important person understands what the goals are and what the strategies are, you've got a successful organization. And these kids really knew what they were talking about. They had read Thoreau, they had read Gandhi, they had studied nonviolence, they had practiced nonviolence, they had been arrested. And so, it's a really remarkable moment in the country's history. That didn't really answer your question, but they were very important.
You mentioned the very first sit-in at Woolworth that was Tougaloo's faculty.
Yes. Also just recently died was, thank you. But also the other person in the photograph with Joan. And, John Salter. So Tougaloo was definitely a source and a refuge during the movement and during the freedom rides and afterwards. Tougaloo played a very important role, and we were happy to take the riders out there to the chapel and other places during the 50th anniversary.
One other person who was a positive responder to the freedom riders in Jackson was Perry Nussbaum.
Yes.
Who was the rabbi at Temple or at Beth Israel. And he used to drive up there to Parchman every week, and he managed to, at one point, he was supposed to see Jewish kids, but he organized some kind of arrangement where he told the prisoner that all these children who were up there were Jews, and so he was able to minister to all of those. Yeah,
he was a regular visitor and a welcome visitor, and also wrote form letters to parents of the kids who were in Parchman and said, "I saw your son, daughter, blank, recently, and they're okay." So he was, very engaged during that time, as he was later.
Hi, my name is Hezekiah Watkins. Just want to mention, I didn't hear you call the name of Ed King. And he was...
Well, there are a lot of names to be called.
Yeah. And while I have the mic, I also want to say thank you for having the courage and the wisdom to do what you did.
Thank you, Hezekiah.
Thank you.
And Eric, I'd like to ask, you're a professional photographer, that's what you do. You are from Jackson, but what was it that gave you this idea to do this incredible book and to know these people in the way you've known and shared them with all of us?
Well, the second part, it was a gift that I didn't really anticipate when I started on the project. I'd seen some, in the late 90s and the early 2000s, I'd seen some photographic projects where people had worked with historical images. The photographs from Tuol Sleng in Cambodia, they made portraits of everybody before they killed them. And also the same guys did a project of found photographs, civilian and military from North Vietnam. And they were both just really amazing exhibits. And I was thinking, was transitioning from being a magazine editor to being a photographer, and I knew I needed to create my own project. And those things kind of fermented in my brain for a while until one day I was home for Christmas. It must have been like 02 or 03, and was with my sister, I think, or Kate, my wife. And we were over in the parking lot by Cups in the old blood bank, waiting on somebody to get a cup of coffee or something out of the health food store. And all of a sudden I was like, the Sovereignty Commission, they must have photographs. So I called Elise Pittman, and she said, call Christy Wilson. And I did, and then Christy turned me on to Sarah Morrow. And then, Sarah said, well, here's what's in the, there are a lot of other photographs in the Sovereignty Commission file. Not a lot, but some. And she said, mostly what we have is mugshots. And I was like, mugshots, which were very hot in the photographic world at that time. People were buying like mugshot books from the San Francisco Police Department in 1923 at photography fairs. You could see this stuff. So I was like, okay. And at the time, they only had these really simple scans online. So it took me a little while to sort of comprehend what I had stumbled into. And I didn't, people knew the mugshots were there. I didn't discover them. But eventually I thought, well, wow, here's a complete record of everybody who participated in Mississippi and saved by basically our Stasi. So it's really an amazing story. And when I first went out and started photographing people, I was really concentrating on the photograph, and we would chat a little bit. They would start telling me stories. And after about 2 or 3 people, I realized I needed to get a tape recorder. So basically, I have about an hour on tape, more or less, with about 120 of the Freedom Riders who were arrested here. And doing the interviews became almost my favorite part, because they paint a portrait of the movement in 61, they paint a portrait of the country in 1961, new generations going to college, people migrating around the country, immigrants from Eastern Europe into Chicago, and then they all move out to California. If you count by where people were living in 1961, a quarter of the Freedom Riders came from Mississippi, came from California. So you just start to see this really mosaic, this kind of pointillist portrait of the movement and the country as a whole, and it really became incredibly meaningful. Do I need to stop, or can I keep going? I mean, we're off the air, right? Okay, one more story and I'll stop. I remember visiting with a writer in California pretty early on in my work, his name Larry Bell, and he was originally from Georgia and moved to LA with his family as a child. And at that point, you talk first and then make the photograph. So while they're talking, I'm like studying them, looking for their best pose, and also looking around in their house, where can I make the picture, and sort of being aware of the time and how much time we have left. And he starts telling me stories that I don't really want to hear, so I'm kind of being impatient with him. He's telling me stories about other things besides the Freedom Rides. And he told me a story about his family losing their land in Georgia. And I think back now, and it's like, man, I just, I hadn't even really knew about people being run off, run out of town or run off their land in the South in the 50s and the 60s. So that was just, it was an amazing story that I think back now and read the transcript of, and I kind of wish I'd, dug in a little harder there. And then he started talking about the Voting Rights Act. And why was it an act? And why wasn't it a law? And this is in 2003 or 5, something like that. And I'm like, I don't want to hear about the Voting Rights Act. I want to tell me stories about Parchman. But he also told me a great story about they put a whole cell block, say like maybe 15 or 20 black men into the hole in Parchman because they wouldn't say sir, of course, to the guards, the white guards. And they locked him in there, just like, really squeezed him in there and locked the door and turned off the air and everything. So it was a pretty brutal moment. But he went on and on about the Voting Rights Act. I was like, I don't want to hear that. But I realized now, it's like, man, he was right. So, and now, we're back in the middle of this fight that we thought we had solved in the 1960s. So it really led to, that's just one example, I think, of a lot of amazing encounters that I had, hearing people's stories. And I hope I grew a little bit more patient with them over time. But I have really great memories of all these encounters. Thank you, Gene. Thanks, everybody.
Eric had mentioned that Mr. Watkins has a book coming out. We'll have him here for a History's Lunch in May. If you are not already on our email list, you can sign up for it over there and stay in touch with what all we have going on. Eric's second and expanded edition of the book is for sale for $29.95 per copy right over here. Everybody will be glad to sign it at this table afterwards. Thank you all for coming today. I hope we see you next week. Help me thank Eric Etheridge for this program today.